I'm Rachel Whitman, 29 years old, and the night my family called me into the living room still plays in my head like a scene burned into film. My father sat in his recliner, a belt resting on the table beside him like it had been invited there. My mother crossed her arms as though she were waiting for a verdict to be delivered, and my brother stretched out on the couch, smirking as if he were royalty. That night they demanded I go back to washing Eric's clothes, scrubbing his bathroom, and cleaning up after his late-night meals. And that was the moment I finally said no. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone expected you to bow your head. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. My parents loved to keep the lawn trimmed and the windows gleaming so neighbors would believe we were the picture of a proper family. Inside, though, life was anything but even. From the time I was old enough to carry a basket of laundry, I was expected to be useful. My father believed discipline meant strength and obedience meant respect, and my mother enforced his rules without hesitation. Love was not spoken in our home. Usefulness was. Eric, my younger brother, never had to lift a finger. If he spilled something, I cleaned it. If he forgot his homework, I was blamed for not reminding him. When he wanted his uniform ironed late at night, I stayed up to do it. He was the crown of the household, and I was the shadow keeping things running. My parents repeated the same words until they sounded like scripture. You're a girl. Girls keep the house in order. That's your duty. Each command chipped away at me until I no longer knew where service ended and my own self began. Still, a part of me believed that if I worked harder, maybe one day they would see me differently. I folded towels into neat stacks, set my alarm early to brew my father's coffee, and memorized grocery lists before school. But no matter how much I did, it was never enough. The praise never came. Instead, there were reminders that I was lucky to have a roof over my head and food on my plate, as if those were gifts I had to earn. As the years passed, I began to sense the quiet cruelty behind it all. Every time I cried, I was told to stop making trouble. Whenever I asked for fairness, I was told to be grateful. And each time the message sank deeper, my place was to serve, and Eric's place was to be served. That was the foundation of our home, and questioning it meant challenging the very order my father guarded. By the time I was in my late 20s, the pattern was unshakable. My father saw me as someone who owed him loyalty through labor. My mother measured me by how much easier I made her life, and my brother simply accepted it as his right. But under the weight of all those years, I was quietly keeping track, and with every new demand, I felt something inside me shift. The night of the family meeting was when the dam finally cracked. I walked into the living room already knowing I was on trial again. They wanted to remind me of my place, to push me back into silence, to make sure the system they built around me never faltered. What they didn't know was that I had already begun to see their control for what it really was, and that night I was no longer afraid to say no. The living room that night felt more like a courtroom than a gathering space. My father didn't ease into the conversation. He ordered me to sit his tone sharp, as if any hesitation was proof of guilt. I remained standing, arms tense at my sides, knowing that once I sat, I'd already conceded. My brother leaned back against the couch cushions, smirking as if he were watching a performance he'd seen before. My mother stood with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes fixed on me, waiting for my defense to falter. The accusations came quickly. Eric said his shirts weren't folded and his bathroom smelled. He acted like my absence in his routines was an insult to his dignity. My mother tilted her head, disappointment dripping from her voice as if she were speaking to a child. "You've been slacking, Rachel. He needs his clothes pressed, his space kept clean. He deserves better." She said it without hesitation, as if the words had been rehearsed. I blinked at her, hearing the finality in that word deserves. Eric was 17, nearly grown perfectly capable of folding his own laundry and carrying his dishes to the sink. Yet in this house it was treated as my job, a duty handed down with no choice. "He can handle that himself," I said, keeping my voice even. My father's hand twitched against the armrest of his chair. My mother's jaw tightened. Eric's smirk deepened. "Watch your tone," my mother snapped. "He's a boy. He deserves better than this." Her voice held no room for discussion, only command. My father leaned forward, his stare cutting through the space between us. "You were raised to serve. That's how the world works." His words landed heavy, not because they were true, but because I realized he believed them entirely. "No," I said quietly but firmly. "That's how your world works. I'm not doing his chores anymore, not his laundry, not his cleaning, not yours." The words left my mouth with more steadiness than I expected. For a moment the room froze. My mother's eyes widened. Eric's smirk faltered, and my father's face hardened like stone. Then he stood. The belt was already there, coiled on the table, like it had been waiting for this moment. He snatched it up, looping the leather once around his fist. The sound of the first swing cracked through the silence, sharp and final. It cut across my back before I could even take a breath. I stumbled but didn't fall. The second strike caught my arm. My teeth clenched against the sting. The third landed heavier, sending me sideways, my balance nearly gone. "You've forgotten your place," my father roared, his voice echoing against the walls. Each word carried the weight of anger disguised as order. Neither my mother nor my brother moved to stop him. They didn't even flinch. They watched with cold satisfaction, as if I were a lesson being carved out before their eyes. Their silence told me everything I had refused to admit. Until now, they didn't see me as a daughter or a sister. I was only a tool, an investment meant to keep the house running smoothly, and in that moment, they believed I had failed. When my father finally lowered the belt, maybe out of exhaustion rather than mercy, I straightened my back. My skin throbbed, but my voice didn't shake. "I'm not your servant." With those words, I turned away. I didn't grab a suitcase. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even take the cards I had hidden away under my mattress. All I carried was a hoodie, my phone charger, the notebook I had filled with years of quiet records, and a body marked by fresh bruises. I walked out the door without slamming it, without shouting, without looking back. The silence I left behind was louder than any scream. For once, I chose the terms of my leaving. I kept walking until the streetlights blurred into one another, until the houses no longer looked familiar. 2 miles away, I found myself standing in front of Marissa's porch. Her light was still on. I knocked, unsure of how I looked, but certain of how I felt. When she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask what had happened. She didn't press me with questions I wasn't ready to answer. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." That night I lay on a yoga mat in her spare room, curled under a hoodie, every part of me aching. The floor was hard and cold, but for the first time in my life, no one expected me to get up and fix something. No one demanded silence. No one ordered me to serve. In the morning, the scent of pancakes drifted through the house. Marissa's mom called me to the table, her tone light, her smile warm. She noticed the bruise on my arm but didn't pry. "You okay staying here a few days?" she asked gently. When I nodded, she paused before adding, "More than a few." Then she cleared a corner in the storage room, slid in a mattress, and offered me a second-hand dresser. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time, I felt what it was like to breathe without fear. Still, even as I began to settle into that fragile safety, I couldn't shake the question that lingered. My parents hadn't called. They hadn't texted. Not once did they ask where I was or if I was safe. The silence stretched across days, then weeks, growing louder with every hour. It wasn't concern they offered. It wasn't regret. It was nothing. What they didn't realize was that their silence no longer bound me. It had become my own, and soon I would learn how to use it in ways they never expected. The first few nights at Marissa's house were a blur. My body ached from bruises, but it was the silence that kept me awake. Not the heavy silence of my parents' home, where every pause felt like a warning, but a softer kind. It was the sound of a house at rest, one that didn't demand anything from me. Still, I kept expecting my phone to light up, waiting for a message from my family asking where I was. Days passed, and nothing came. I tried to convince myself that the lack of contact was a relief, but it was hard not to feel the weight of being forgotten. I had lived my entire life serving them, and now that I was gone, it seemed like they barely noticed. The ache in my ribs was nothing compared to the ache of that silence. I started flipping through the notebook I had carried with me, the one I used to hide under my mattress. Inside were pages filled with notes I had taken over the years, small records of chores, errands, and sacrifices that no one ever acknowledged. Each entry felt like a piece of my life, written in ink proof that I hadn't imagined the endless demands. One evening I sat at the small desk in Marissa's spare room and began a new list. At the top, I wrote things I did before they said I wasn't enough. The words came quickly at first. Cooked breakfast, lunch, and dinner, scrubbed Eric's bathroom every weekend, ironed school uniforms, grocery runs after class, packed lunches before sunrise. But as I kept writing, the memories deepened. I remembered hiding my own report card so Eric's grades wouldn't look bad by comparison. I remembered taking the blame when he broke the blender staying up late to reheat meals for Dad, when I had exams the next day, apologizing for things I hadn't done just to keep the peace. The pages filled faster than I expected. 10, then 15, each one layered with years of invisible work. When I stopped, I looked down at a stack of proof that I had carried more than anyone should. It was no longer just a notebook. It was a ledger. Every line whispered the same truth they owed me, not in money, but in respect and acknowledgement, and they had given me neither. The realization settled in quietly. I had always believed that if I just worked harder, they would see me. That maybe someday I would be something more than a body filling the gaps in their lives. But the evidence in front of me told a different story. My efforts had never been about love. They had been about control. That shift was difficult to face. Nights in Marissa's spare room felt safer than anywhere I had ever been, but safety didn't erase the years of silence I had carried. I had been told not to cry, not to complain, not to expect anything beyond survival. Those words had become so familiar that they clung to me even when I was finally free of the house where they were spoken. Sometimes I caught myself flinching at small sounds, bracing for a demand that never came. If the oven timer went off, my shoulders tightened, as if I had forgotten something important. If Marissa left a cup on the table, my first instinct was to pick it up before she could notice. My habits were stitched so deeply into me that even in kindness, I searched for orders. Marissa never made me feel out of place. She gave me room to breathe, and her mother offered me meals without expectation. They let me rest without asking for anything in return. Yet the quiet brought back every phrase that had shaped me. Be useful. Know your place. Don't be dramatic. Don't be... They were no longer spoken, but they echoed in my head like a script I couldn't erase. I began carrying the notebook with me wherever I went, flipping through its pages as if reading them would remind me that the weight I felt wasn't imagined. The more I read, the clearer the pattern became. I hadn't been raised to be loved. I had been raised to be useful. That thought stayed with me through long nights of studying in the corner of the spare room, when the ache of old bruises still lingered. It stayed with me when Marissa's mom made pancakes and asked gentle questions about how long I planned to stay. It stayed with me every time I checked my phone, hoping to see a single message from home that never came. The silence from my family was its own answer. They weren't worried. They weren't searching. They weren't even pretending to miss me. They were adjusting, maybe even expecting me to crawl back. But I didn't intend to. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I had been trained to endure, to bend under pressure, to absorb every demand without breaking. What my parents hadn't realized was that endurance could be reshaped. They thought they had taught me obedience. What they had really given me was resilience, and I was beginning to understand how to use it. I closed the notebook one night and placed it at the foot of my bed. It wasn't just a record anymore. It was preparation. Every page was proof of what I had survived and what I would no longer allow. My silence had always been their weapon, but now it belonged to me. As I drifted to sleep, I knew the hardest part was not behind me. It was still coming, because the more I accepted the truth on those pages, the clearer it became that I couldn't just walk away. I had to decide what to do with everything I had gathered, and that decision would change everything. The notebook on my dresser became more than a place for old memories. Each night I opened it and added new pages, writing in careful lines, so there was no mistaking what had happened in that house. At first, the notes felt like confessions, a way to ease the heaviness that clung to me. Soon, though, the words began to look different. They weren't just accounts of chores or punishments. They were records. I started to see a pattern I had never fully admitted to myself before. Every demand, every order, every dismissal fit into a larger shape. My life inside that house had not been about family at all. It had been about control. What they called love came with conditions. What they called care came with obligations. The proof was right in front of me in black ink, page after page. I carried the notebook everywhere, sliding it into my backpack when I left Marissa's house for work or school. It became a quiet anchor, a reminder that my feelings weren't exaggerations or faulty memories. Whenever doubt crept in, the kind that whispered, maybe I had been too sensitive, I flipped through the pages. There it was, laid out in simple words. Dates, tasks, the endless cycle of being useful and never thanked. It wasn't only chores that I recorded. I wrote down the phrases that still echoed in my head. Be useful. Don't argue. You'll understand when you're older. Words spoken without shouting, but with enough force to sink into me like stones. Reading them in my own handwriting made them clearer than ever. They weren't rules to guide me. They were instructions to keep me small. Some nights, the weight of those pages left me staring at the ceiling for hours. It was painful to face, but also strangely steadying. The ledger showed me not just what they had taken, but how I had survived. Each entry was a reminder that I had endured every slight, every demand, and still stood on the other side of it. Marissa noticed the nights I sat up late with the lamp still on. "You're still writing?" she asked one evening, leaning against the doorframe. I nodded but didn't explain. She didn't press. She just handed me a glass of water and left me to it. That kind of quiet support was new to me, and it made me all the more certain of what I was doing. The longer I kept at it, the more the notebook felt less like a diary and more like preparation. I had no plans yet, no clear idea of what to do with the words I had gathered, but I knew they meant something. They were proof that my life in that house had been stripped down to transactions: work in exchange for shelter, obedience in exchange for the absence of punishment. It was unsettling to realize how much of my childhood and teenage years had been spent in that rhythm. Even my birthdays had been wrapped in it. I remembered cards with lines like, "Make us proud," instead of "We love you." I remembered gifts that came with expectations attached, never given freely. Each memory added to the ledger until it grew too thick to ignore. I stopped defending myself in conversations with Marissa about my parents. I no longer tried to explain why I had stayed so long or why leaving had been so hard. The evidence was right there. Every entry, every page was enough explanation. It freed me from having to justify what I had endured. The words also began to change something inside me. Where once I had felt only exhaustion, now there was a sharper clarity. I began to understand that silence could serve me differently. It had been their tool, a way to keep me from speaking out. But it could also be mine sharpened into something stronger than shouting. As weeks passed, I noticed the way my hand steadied when I wrote, how the pen no longer wavered across the page. I was not just recording anymore. I was building something. I didn't know if it was a case, a shield, or a weapon, but I knew it was growing into more than notes. Each time I turned a page, I thought of the house I had left behind. The perfect lawn, the spotless windows, the neat image of a family who seemed to have it all together. I knew what those neighbors never saw, that the shine came from my work, not from pride. Without me there, the illusion couldn't last. That thought lingered as I closed the notebook one night and slid it under my pillow. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I simply knew. They had spent years teaching me to be quiet, to endure, to keep order without complaint. And they had never realized that in doing so, they were also teaching me how to observe, how to remember, how to prepare. I had stopped waiting for their apology. I had stopped waiting for recognition that would never come. What I was waiting for now was something different. The moment when the weight of their own neglect would meet the silence I was ready to hold against them. That moment wasn't here yet, but I could feel it drawing closer with every page I filled. The weeks at Marissa's house gave me more space than I had ever known. For the first time, my choices belonged only to me. I walked to the bus stop in the morning, went to class, and came home to a place where no one barked orders when I walked through the door. Even the smallest routines felt new, cooking a simple meal, folding laundry I had worn myself, setting my alarm without worrying about someone else's schedule. The work was still there, but it was mine. The silence from my family didn't change. No calls, no texts, no messages through neighbors. At first, I checked my phone constantly, almost expecting an apology that would never come. When nothing arrived, I stopped waiting. Instead, I turned to practical things. Marissa's mom helped me file for financial independence. She signed as a witness while I filled out paperwork that cut off my parents' access to my school records and medical files. For the first time, their reach didn't extend into every corner of my life. I opened a new bank account in my own name and transferred the small savings I had set aside over the years. I changed the password on my phone carrier and locked down every detail I could think of. Each step was quiet but steady, the kind of work I had once done for them, but now done for myself. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was protection. On a late afternoon, with the light fading through the blinds in the spare room, I pulled out my phone and scanned the bruises on my arm and back. I didn't share the pictures with anyone. I just saved them in a folder marked private proof of what had happened if I ever needed it. The act was clinical, almost detached, but it gave me a strange sense of calm. This time, their actions didn't disappear into silence. They had been recorded, and I held the record. As the days moved forward, the list in my notebook kept growing. I no longer wrote just to remember. I wrote to prepare. Every chore, every insult, every reminder that I was lucky to live under their roof went into those pages. The more I added, the more I realized they had built a system around me, one that looked strong, but was fragile without my constant labor. And now that system was running without me. 3 weeks passed before I heard anything about them. I was helping Marissa's mom carry grocery bags up the porch steps when she mentioned it. "I saw your mother at the store today," she said softly. "She looked tired. Asked the clerk to bag her groceries because her back was out." She paused before adding, "She didn't look hurt, just overwhelmed." That evening I opened my notebook again and started a new page. What they lose without me. I wrote slowly at first. Laundry, meals, rides to school, clean bathrooms. Then I added more order in the house, coffee ready by 6, someone to keep the neighbors from noticing the cracks. The list was shorter than the ones I had made before, but it carried a different weight. It wasn't about what I had given, it was about what they no longer had. Within a week, more small signs trickled in. Marissa's cousin, who lived near my old house, sent me a photo of Eric carrying a trash bag stuffed with clothes into a laundromat. His face was tight with frustration, his shoulders hunched. A neighbor mentioned that my father had started showing up late to work and snapping at clients. Rumors spread that he'd been written up after an outburst during a staff meeting. Even Eric's teachers had begun sending unanswered emails home about missed assignments. Then one evening my phone buzzed with a message. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't concern. It was my mother writing as though nothing had happened. Eric has an awards dinner this Friday. None of his suits are ironed. You need to stop being ridiculous and come home. I didn't respond. 4 days later, another message arrived, this time from my father. This is childish. No one will tolerate your behavior in the real world. Come home, apologize, and we'll let you earn your place again. I stared at the words for a long time. They were familiar, the same tone, the same expectation that my worth came from service. But I wasn't that person anymore. I took screenshots of both texts and saved them next to the photos of my bruises, not to show anyone, just to remind myself who they were. By then, my days had started to look different. I had enrolled in a local community college, working toward a nursing program. I lived full-time in the spare room at Marissa's, helped with dinner, and studied late at the kitchen table. I took the bus to campus in the mornings and worked part-time at a bookstore on weekends. It wasn't easy, but every piece of it felt solid. It was mine, to build, mine to manage. Meanwhile, the Whitman house grew quieter in the background of my life. The updates reached me without effort, like whispers carried by neighbors and friends. Eric skipped more classes. My mother leaned on the church for meal help, claiming her health was failing. My father's temper only grew worse at work. They told neighbors that I had left for an internship, a story meant to preserve their pride. I didn't correct it. Let them hold on to whatever version of me suited their image. One night, sitting at my desk, I slid the notebook to the side and opened a fresh box I had been keeping under the bed. Inside, I placed all the small tokens of the past, the chore lists they used to tape to the fridge the birthday card where my mother had written, "We didn't plan for you, but God has a purpose," and the broken locket I had been given at 13 with the words, "So you remember, we didn't have to keep you." At the very top, I placed the printed ledger, 52 pages bound together with the title, Unpaid Labor Years, 1017. I closed the box, sealed it with tape, and wrote their address on the front. There was no note, no return address, just silence in a form they couldn't ignore. At dawn, I carried it across town and set it on their porch. I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I left it there and walked away, my steps steady against the pavement. For once, I didn't look back. I didn't expect to hear anything after I left the box on their porch. I told myself I was finished, that whatever happened inside that house no longer belonged to me. Still, 2 days later, Marissa's cousin sent me a message. She had seen my father open the front door late in the morning. He stared down at the box, pale and still, before finally carrying it inside. They didn't come out again for hours. I imagined them sitting around the kitchen table, each page of that ledger laid out like evidence. 52 pages of chores, demands, insults, and orders, all written in my hand. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Silence has a way of making the truth harder to ignore. Life at Marissa's carried on as normal. I worked shifts at the bookstore, went to class, and studied in the evenings. My routine was small but steady, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was waiting on someone else's expectations. Yet news of my family's unraveling reached me without effort. Neighbors whispered, friends sent small updates. It was never something I sought out, but the details always found their way to me. Eric had been seen storming out of a job fair, his clothes wrinkled, and his temper visible to anyone nearby. My father collapsed at the grocery store one afternoon, someone saying it was from stress. My mother started posting in online groups with titles like Parents of Ungrateful Children, her words filled with complaints about how no one appreciated her sacrifices. They were still performing the same roles, only now without the system I had once upheld. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't correct the rumors they spread about me leaving for an internship. I didn't message back when distant relatives hinted that my parents were struggling. I just kept building my own life. Every dish I washed was mine. Every shirt I folded belonged to me. That simple fact felt more powerful than any confrontation could have. Still, I knew the silence was beginning to work. What they once used against me had become the very thing that unsettled them most. My absence pressed against them every day, a reminder of the work they could no longer ignore. The house that once looked perfect on the outside was beginning to show its cracks. One Friday night, as I lit a candle in my small studio apartment, I realized I no longer carried the same heaviness in my chest. I wasn't waiting for them to understand. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I had turned their lessons inside out. They had raised me to obey, but in teaching me endurance, they had given me the patience to walk away and never look back. The turning point wasn't in the box I left on their porch. It wasn't even in the silence that followed. It was in knowing that I didn't need them to see my worth anymore. My justice had already begun the moment I refused to step back into that house. And though I didn't say a word, the message was clear enough. They were the ones who had to live with the silence now. Weeks after I left the box on their porch, the updates continued to find me. They came in fragments: a message from a girl at church, a photo from a neighbor, a passing comment overheard at the grocery store. None of it was dramatic, but all of it painted the same picture. The system that once ran so smoothly inside the Whitman house had begun to collapse. Eric had stopped going to class regularly. His teachers sent notes that went unanswered. A neighbor spotted him sitting on the curb outside the laundromat, his clothes stuffed into a plastic bag, his frustration plain in the slump of his shoulders. My mother leaned harder on the church, asking for meal assistance, explaining that her health had taken a turn. And my father, once steady in his job, had started showing cracks. He missed deadlines, raised his voice at coworkers, and eventually fainted in the middle of a grocery store aisle. People whispered about stress, but no one seemed surprised. I didn't chase those details, but they reached me anyway. Each new piece of news carried the same message without me. The house no longer held together. What they had mistaken for structure had always been my labor, and now they were forced to see the difference. The texts from my parents had stopped after I ignored the first few. My phone stayed quiet, their silence heavy but familiar. For years they had used silence as a way to control me, to make me feel small. Now it worked against them. Their absence no longer bent me down. It weighed on them instead. I thought about the box often, not in regret but in recognition. Inside had been everything they demanded and everything they dismissed handed back in the only way I knew would matter. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't argued, I hadn't shown up at their door for a fight. I had let the proof speak for itself. At the same time, my life had begun to feel steady in a way I had never known. The studio apartment I rented near campus was small, one window, a creaky floor, a bathroom that alternated between freezing and scalding water, but it was mine. I worked at the bookstore in the afternoons, took classes in the mornings, and studied late into the night. Each Friday I lit a candle on the windowsill, not as a ritual for healing, but simply because I wanted to. No one else dictated the choice. It struck me how different the work felt when it was for myself. Washing dishes, folding clothes, cooking a meal. The tasks were the same, but the weight was gone. Every movement felt like a quiet declaration that my life belonged to me. Meanwhile, the Whitmans were unraveling. My mother turned to online groups for sympathy posting under headings like, "When children forget who raised them." My father's reputation at work slipped further with each outburst. Eric floundered between school and small jobs, never quite able to settle. The stories reached me one after another, each confirming what I had known all along. The justice I wanted wasn't loud. It didn't need police reports or public accusations. It lived in the silence they now carried in the absence they couldn't fill. Every demand they had placed on me had been returned to them as emptiness, and every piece of work they had taken for granted now stood unfinished. I didn't need to return to that house to prove anything. My proof was already there, sealed in the box they had opened with their own hands. My place was here in the life I had chosen, surrounded by people who didn't see me as labor, but as a person. And yet even with the quiet around me, I knew one more step remained. What I had done so far had been enough to shake their world, but the final weight of silence had not yet fallen. It was still waiting, steady and certain, for the right moment to land. The last time I passed through my old neighborhood, I didn't slow down. The houses looked the same, but I didn't glance toward the porch where I had once left that box. My hands were steady around my grocery list, my keys resting in my pocket. There was no reason to look back anymore. By then, I had built a life that belonged entirely to me. The bookstore where I worked felt like a second home, the quiet aisles lined with stories that reminded me there was more to the world than the one I had left behind. My nursing classes were difficult, but each lesson gave me something real to work towards, something earned on my own terms. At night, I returned to the small apartment where every dish, every folded shirt, every candle lit on the windowsill was mine. The Whitman house, I heard, had grown colder. My father's health kept faltering. My mother leaned further into her online groups, and Eric struggled to find steady work. The shine of that perfect family had dulled, but I didn't need to see it to believe it. I knew the truth. They had built their world on my silence, and when I took that silence back, everything else began to crumble. I used to think revenge was loud, something fiery and destructive. What I learned instead was that sometimes it's as quiet as footsteps walking away and never turning back. I didn't need to argue, to prove, or to demand. My absence was proof enough. Looking back, I see now that they didn't teach me obedience. They taught me endurance. And endurance, when reshaped, becomes strength. The kind of strength that allows you to leave a house that never felt like home and build one of your own, even if it's small and creaky and imperfect. Justice didn't come to me in the form of apologies or recognition. It came in learning that peace can be louder than pain if you give it time. It came in realizing that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. So that's where I'll leave this part of my life. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the quiet steadiness of knowing I walked away and never let them pull me back. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're listening from in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, feel free to subscribe.